All right, Mehrad, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to chatting with you. I am Kim with Work on Climate, and Mehrad has graciously offered to give us some time both for a recording today, where we're going to talk about how early founders can think about the type of climate and social impact that they can have, but also for an AMA in 10 days' time. So on January 23rd, Mehrad, you're going to be joining us on Slack, Enroll Founders, to answer questions from anyone in our community about any of the topics that we're discussing today. So video is a bit of just to get your gears turning. So yeah, um, today, a couple things we're trying to achieve. Trying to give early stage climate founders a framework of sorts to think about how do you assess that potential carbon impact really early on. We'll talk about some tools that already exist and how they may or may not serve early stage founders. Talk a little bit about the factors that come into play, including a little bit about social impact, which a lot of our founders in Work on Climate's community are interested in as well. And finally, storytelling, which, as someone with a background in storytelling, uh, really gets to me that I think we don't get into it enough. It's not enough to understand your impact, be it financial or carbon, but if you can't talk about it, none of it matters. So we'll end with a bit of discussion on how to be persuasive once you have sold yourself on the story, essentially. So, Mehrad, thanks again for joining us. Do you want to give a little bit of an intro to who you are and what you're all about right now?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Look, I've been a long time work on climate. It was kind of where I kind of started my own climate journey. So I think background, former founder, I was in e-commerce, ad tech. I also did a lot of corporate innovation, like incubator accelerator work back when I lived in Dubai. A bit of foresight, aka futures type of mega trend projecting. And yeah, I woke up to the climate situation like a lot of people, red sky event, and I said, hey, this seems like a big problem. Can I apply different things I've learned myself through the founding years, but I had also started angel investing towards the last years of my founding years. And I said I need to learn more about climate. So Work on Climate was one of these communities I joined. So just shout out to Work on Climate and how wonderful it is. And I met various people that were working on various projects, and I said, hey, I can help in these different capacities. Working with my friend Sam on a board game called Solutions, which was primarily based off the research from Drawdown, Paul Hawken. Later did some work with Cardo. We ran a program with them, Climate Change for VCs. So this is where primarily a lot of my work and what I'm known for. I'm a founding partner of Cool Climate Collective. We were a group of founders and operators, I mean like tech operators, who said, hey, we want to do something about climate. We were already kind of angel investing. And so when I started putting together some deals I was looking at from a personal perspective, we started syndicating those, and my space being very early founding kind of experience. I would get along with founders at those early stages. So, and that's where I thought this is where I think we can make a difference as well, given the background of our individuals. So we were more than just, oh, we're just going to invest in this company. It was more, we only invest if we think from a collective perspective, there's something we can add to it, whether that's on the go-to-market, whether that's someone technical. And as we've grown the community, we've realized we have all these different skill sets of people within the investing community that some are now connected, but they aren't actually investors. They're just people who want to help. And what we realized is we've been able to start spinning up more than just ventures or investing in ventures. More we've been spinning out kind of like support services. So one of the first ones we spun out was something called the Climate Patent Collective. Helps with early stage IP work, but at the same time, it helps us on due diligence and de-risking the company with their kind of costs on that front. So that's how we think. So even though Cool Climate Collective is known for early stage investing, I actually think we do a lot more in terms of building out what I like to do is ecosystem building. So uh, happy to support this program, Work on Climate in any way I can. Yeah, we can get into it if you want.
Yeah, thank you for that intro. I love what Cool Climate Collective does, and you were exactly the person I wanted to reach out to for this conversation, in large part because of it. So, just like as some context for people who are watching, at Work on Climate, we support climate founders at any stage, but it just tends to be a lot of our founders in our community, at least those who are active, are really early stage. some who are former founders who are just getting into the climate space, or others who are at the really early stages of their entrepreneurial journey, and maybe have some kind of background in energy, something like that. And one topic that comes up again and again is like, what do I do? Like, I have this energy, I have this skill set. I've, maybe walked this path before. How do I decide like where I should be focusing my energy? Obviously, carbon is a big part of that. It has to make financial sense, of course, but it needs to be impactful in a number of ways. And that type of balance, I think, is a unique challenge and adds a lot of complexity when you're thinking about founding a company in the climate space. So that's part of why we wanted to talk today. There are a lot of cool tools out there. Green tool, which I know that we'll talk about, but they're just a little bit further down and they're not quite the right thing. We'll get into that in more detail. So again, just want to like talk about those really early days. What does it look like to understand the carbon impact? How do you decide how to move forward, where to move forward? So I would first like to just sort of talk about that kind of sometimes competing motivation of like profit and like, you need to have financial ROI, especially if you're looking for a sort of traditional startup, but it also has to have climate impact. So how do you see this play out, especially with like first time, really early stage climate founders?
Well, I think even just to start is like, well, no matter what you're doing, whatever you're founding the company, it's a company, right? Unless it's you're doing a nonprofit, you need to kind of work within the system or capitalist system. So if you want really something to be impactful and for it to scale, it needs to kind of adjust or co-opt or be integrated within the existing capitalist system. We can always think down the line, if different society, but right now, the thing that kind of builds trust among different parties, different stakeholders is money typically. Like it gets corporates to move, it gets different, you can incentivize employees. So I think we're going to get into the carbon stuff, but I just want to highlight that we're still within the bounds of like this capitalist system, and therefore we always have to keep that in mind. You can always figure out different unique, innovative, I guess, financing structures, but it's likely not venture or even like private equity or any even just bootstrapping a business like that. It's probably donation or philanthropic if it doesn't have a business case. And I always say, like, I think for me personally and the companies we look at is we like to see a strong business case. But again, what that business case is, what is the triple bottom line? This whole concept of impact investing is like how we like to think of it. And I always get the joke I hear from other investors like, well, isn't all investing impact investing, right? Like someone gets a wage and all that. It's like, yeah, but I how I look at it is impacting investing is investing with the impact with intention. So like you're intentionally investing for that impact. And that's where it's like, if it means a slightly different business model where the margins or the stakeholders are differentiated, but you actually get to scale more, maybe that's what impact looks like. But at the end of the day, like I said, every business grows with kind of money coming in. So we have to consider that. Going back to your question on like the carbon impact, I think that's, anyone even new to climate is just, you're still grappling around this very complex system. This like climate change in itself, it's a very complex system. And, sometimes it's not fully there yet. And then like pointing out to all the wildfires right now, how much of that was carbon related but at the end, when you do get to the meat of the matter and you understand energy systems and energy buildup and drier wind and everything that might contribute, climate does play a role. How much is where you'll have back and forth even among scientists. But I think at the end of the day, it's this understanding that yes, there's this imperative. I think that's like the core thing. Like, do we all share a North Star? I think work on climate is like the perfect definition. People joining the community, there's already the intent. You want to work within this space. Now it's like, okay, how do I, again, when I say that, it's like with my own experience, my background, my connections, do the most within that space. There's obviously, and you hinted like there's tools we're going to get into and talk about like En-ROADS. En-ROADS has a simulator that you can kind of see the different industries and kind of their impact. There's a climate finance tracker that you kind of see where the finance flows are going into climate, but that's at like top level, just understanding the market. And that's great. Like if you want to like consider, I want to go attack the automotive space because I see such a big but I always think like, well, that's where you see a lot of climate finance or financing gets bucketed as within maybe transport. But that could come and look at EVs, right? Or hybrid vehicles is making up a large chunk of it. And it can either persuade you and think, oh, that's a huge industry, I should get into that, and that's where the money's flowing, or it's already saturated. And maybe what I really want to get into is kind of like the impact component of, yes, a lot of money's flowing there, but how impactful is that? Just put one concept out there. It's like not many people understand contrails and how those kind of work. A podcast we worked on launching called Climate on the Edge had an episode on contrails, but the takeaway was like if you consider how little funding or how much exposure it gets, but the potential impact of it, again, you need to still figure out a business model that makes sense to mitigate and reduce contrails. But it's really just route mapping. It's such a simple, high level simplicity of route mapping of altitude of the planes and where they're going. And it doesn't even have too much route adjustment. So it's not going to cost more fuel, but the potential impact is huge. But my point is, what's a business model there? So it's a very complicated question to answer. How does one design? But you have to consider all these components of if the solution I'm trying to solve for within the system it operates in is huge, maybe that's impactful. My point being like, yeah, we think solar and it's such a massive opportunity, and you're like, hey, well, I can create this one component. But if that one component is, let's say, something like that just moves the panels, and the potential of using that or improving efficiency is like only 6%. And that in itself, how many of these panels would actually be able to afford and the economics make sense? It starts to look even smaller and smaller. And it's like, does it make sense for me to figure out a new type of motor for having panels adjust and optimizing more? And that's where it comes back to, well, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's another hardware that's 90% of the market. Is it a whole new category? And that's where it's like going back to the just two concepts of co-opting or competing. Like, are we thinking of co-opting the existing industry that has distribution and marketplace? And are we designing something that can drop into their solution or add on to their solution, but it's co-opting? It's at the end of the day realizing the urgency of the problem. We don't have decades to build up the next monopoly in this little niche industry, which could be billions, but we just don't have the time affordability. It's like, okay, so it might not be going head to head competing, but it's co-opting. But then now to go down the co-opting route, well, I need to understand your whole system, your supply chain. And this is where it gets very complex very quickly, because not only are that first level was you're trying to understand industry and just a high level, but as you go deeper and you try and use these tools like Crane that kind of give you some level of like the carbon impact, there's a whole other side of like the capitalist actual integration component. What kind of financing would be needed for this? If this needs a lot of capex or debt-based financing, who are the financiers of that? And do they even look at that? Have they even done anything in that space? Same thing with the industry leaders. Are they actually innovating? Do they care about this issue? How do we make them care about this issue? So this we'll get into, but storytelling is going to be a huge part of this. I think finding where you fit, I hinted at earlier, experience. Do you have experience in industry? That is not a prerequisite, but do you have enough experience to be able to go down the path of understanding the industry and co-opting those people who are in the industry? I always think of founders like, you don't necessarily always have to be the person who knows the most about the space, but you need to be the one who recognizes there's a lot to learn. And even from the expert side, maybe they're missing something because they've been so ingrained within it. But also from an outsider perspective, if you're too naive and not realizing, not from the solution itself, but the system that the solution operates in, that there's a lot of friction. And I don't just mean like, oh, let's figure out how to go to market and we can get it, but actual friction of adoption from, well, the way their assets are currently located, with the factory you're going to co-op, well, they can't actually add on to their building. Maybe it's a land issue, and this could be the case on cement or concrete kind of place. But sometimes they're in very valuable real estate, and it's such a huge risk for them to kind of want to even partner, even if there's intent on shareholder letters. Oh yeah, we're very interested in this. The reality is slightly different from business ops. So there is this layer of breaking it down, understanding the system everything operates within, and it starts to get very complicated very fast. So I just want to I like that. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of look into all of the different factors to consider. And what I see in a lot of early stage is first time climate founders is this idealism that is very heartening, but like you said, if there isn't a business play and if it needs to be scaled, the best solution doesn't matter. If you can't roll it out, if you can't make it work from a financial perspective, it's dead. And I sense maybe there's some like ickiness there, especially to people who haven't done this before, who haven't, had a startup journey of their own in the past. Why do you think that is? Or I mean, I have my own hypotheses, but how do you help people sort of reconcile that? I think a lot of folks come in with like this heart of gold. They're trying to change the world. They're trying to solve climate change, but are often resistant to the like financial realities. Like, how do you help them come to terms with that?
I think there's a few perspectives here, but one can be just as simple as like, climate in itself is a lot of hardware, or it's moving atoms. There's bits as well, but a lot of times at the end of the day, the end result is moving these atoms. A lot of former founders, at least in the tech world, come from software. And software, we can A/B test a lot quicker. We can go to market a lot quicker. The limited runway you have, you can do a lot more things. It's a lot harder when we're talking about like actual um, end results being an atom or proving out, and it might mean 6 months of just a pilot of getting that data to be able to convince the bigger corporate to come on board. That 6 months, you typically don't have that 6 month just waiting time, data gathering time that a software solution might have had. So that's just one perspective. Like, hey, we can move faster than we think we can. Um, Although I'm all for moving as fast as we can, that's why we think of how do we help with distribution and go to market. But it comes back to there's a certain reality of a lot of those capital allocators or those industry people we want to co-opt. They're going through their own learning and they have their own shareholders. So you have to also understand the perspective they're coming from, even if they're the well-intentioned, aligned. It just sometimes can't move faster than the systems that kind of made that company successful in the first place. So they're more afraid to move fast. What was the next part you had asked? Or what were
I think we can, I think you've touched upon one of the next questions here, but I really want to zoom in on like, okay, so if we assume that founders are looking at a couple of potential solutions, they have, business model aside, even though we know that's very important and we just talked about that. How do early stage founders, when they're really in that like problem space exploration, maybe doing some early customer discovery, how do you understand what's going to have an impact from a carbon standpoint?
Yeah, I think what I like to do, or again, this is just me sharing our experience and my own experience, but I think in this specific problem statement, I always think of baseline. If you think of climate, if we're solving for climate, we have to reimagine a lot of our systems, how we produce, consume, manufacture, all of these different types of uh, assets and systems have to kind of revamp. So just as simple as baseline comparison. What is in the market today, whether that's from market share and all that, and then now break that apart and understand that specific current solutions carbon impact. So it's almost like, is there an opportunity space that we disrupt this? Like if you're saying, hey, it's one ingredient that goes into my drink, I think I have a great way to do it. But once you realize one, the market size for that ingredient is not that massive, and you realize, oh, it's actually not that big a deal, even though it's a terrible carbon footprint from, let's say, deforestation of that specific genus of trees. The issue is specifically, well, there's not much of that happening. And that market size from a business side is already small, but also the impact is like this is relatively small compared to cocoa beans, right? Cocoa tree and all. So that's a whole different market. So I think that baseline comparison is from a business, but also carbon comparative helps. And then just, from there is where you start going down your own path. Like, well, my solution, even at a high level, would displace this part, this part, and this part. Like we have co-location, so we don't have transport costs, and transport costs referring to actual financial costs, but also the carbon cost. And then going down next, well, our process system is 2 versus 5 steps, and that in itself has some other. And then once you start calculating those, does this start to look attractive from both those perspectives? I always like to almost think of things in parallel, even if you're just assessing a technical component of yours, at a high level, you should know what the potential financial repercussions of that. Because to go through that whole exercise and then later come back, oh wait, that one piece that we said is so simple to change, it blows the cogs through the roof, the cost of the goods sold, and no one will buy it. None of the existing manufacturers, even at scale, you will barely get close to where we operate, and we don't even have margin. So like it starts to sound like a bad business. So some of that helps to do in parallel, but I think I always start with that baseline understanding of what you're trying to get into and what the, you know, what is the modus operandi today? What is the MO of this solution? And that's where it's like, where tangents of attack, right? Are you going to try and co-opt it? Is it add to it? Is it completely disrupted? That's fine. But you need to know where you're starting from and having a baseline. You know, you could jump into a new, fresh industry, but you need to figure out the baselines of all the assumptions you'll need before jumping into, okay, does it even make sense as a business and going down those MVP thinking routes.
Yeah, I like that. Kind of taking those steps in tandem, looking at it from both a financial and a carbon impact perspective at the same time. Don't waste time, right? Like if this isn't going to play out on one of two fronts, it's not for you.
Yeah.
Move on quickly. Yeah. Talk to me about Crane Tool. For those who are not familiar with that, what is it and who is it geared towards?
Well, Crane Tool, I think it came on a Project Frame. I won't give the history of it, but it's a great tool for assessing the carbon reduction of new enterprises specifically. So they have this system where you can put in your technology, and then what it instantly does, you can just hit skip and jump to understanding it more. Like it'll give you an output, but you can actually customize um, specific inputs because it'll fill in with some types of incumbent unit economics. So what I was referring to, kind of like those baseline assumptions. So even if you are tackling something that is already a climate solution, but you think you can do it better, there's already some of that embedded numbers, and they also give you the references. So that's where even for the earlier stage founders, because everything I'm describing right now, you kind of need to know some of your own assumptions or some of the inputs and even just understand the market more. Because once you go in there, you're gonna be like, wait, what are these incumbent inputs I didn't even think about? So you want to be a bit further along before trying to tackle that. But what it is useful, even for the early stage, I would say, is those references. So you might not know what the kind of like the go-to references. Crane, for the most part, has done a great job and it's continuously kind of updated. So it's like the references they use for their inputs of figuring out is this carbon reducing, right? CO2e, right? Not only carbon dioxide, but like the equivalent. It has great sources, and you can use that for your own TA of sorts. I always think like techno-economic analysis before thinking about, oh, I need a consultant to get this all right and certify my TA. Think from your own perspective, and what a tool that works brilliant that we all have access to is some of these LLMs now. Again, you like think of Claude or OpenAI creating those individual projects, feeding it your own knowledge base so it doesn't make its own assumptions, but in getting these references from places like Crane and you start to put in all those as and you put that in a knowledge base and then you start prompting it and have a discussion just to get a high level, I would say, of where you think the TA lands. And I always think of TA as always understanding within again the systems. For me, systems thinking is one. I'll sound like a broken record, but like systems is what we operate within. And going back to TA as well, specifically, your solution, where does it fall in this broader system, right? You're going for EVs. Where are you going for? Is it from the battery side? Is it from tires, right? Like, what's the innovation we've had on tires in that space? Like, there's only a handful of companies I would say are considered interesting that are doing some things there. But there's two components to that. There's the pollution component, rubber, right? Rubber itself, microplastics, and have all these other negative social consequences. But we typically are not as aware, and consumers for the most part aren't. So does that narrative later when we get to storytelling, does that make sense? Or is it now on the efficiency of the EVs, right? Even some of the incumbents have started to create like what they claim is like EV tires that get more efficiency because the load of the car, the weight of the car is heavier. The point is like what narrative makes sense, right? And but again, those same companies aren't doing the alternative solution that's not doing the microplastics. So is there a blend of these two? Are there opportunities? But at the end of the day, um, going back to Crane, it's a great tool. I just think for those very early in the journey, the most useful part is maybe just putting in the technology you're kind of looking at. One, getting the variables that you've never heard of, like just go through that list of the incumbent unit economics, and they're like, okay, what are these? I need to consider these, and then the references. Those are, I guess, use those. But then how I tend to do it with our team as well. We'll now use our own LM prompting using some of those references, knowledge bases when it's something new and we have never heard of, or exploring a new industry. And that's where I think the brilliance of climate is like anyone with the ambition and the drive, you can apply your skills. And the whole work on climate, the ethos that made sense for me from day one was around there's all these people motivated. And at the same time, going back to the community, there's a lot of people out there willing to help if you're very clear with your ask, right? With your prompt to the community, there's high likelihood you could get connected to the right person who can help, answer that specific contextual problem. And that's where it's accelerated, right? We can accelerate going to market with what we know works. If you're a former founder or an operator who's worked at these companies, you've seen at least something that works. And now you're trying to think, well, I want to bring this to climate, but I don't know anything about climate. Well, the community, as well as tools, everything can fill these gaps, but you just need to know how to even go about using, or even creating the mental model that this isn't like a SaaS product only. It works within all these different complex systems because, like I said, climate is a complex system. So, yeah.
So earlier you hinted at a couple other resources, and before this recording, we were talking a little bit about like data sources, like where do you start with some of these things? So what are some other resources in addition to Crane Tool that early stage founders should be looking at?
Yeah. The two I referenced earlier, what was En-ROADS? En-ROADS runs this simulation, and we'll probably put the link, right. So En-ROADS has a simulation of just more related to IPCC and where we're going, kind of like temperature-wise, but it breaks it down into different sectors, industries, and you kind of see what the status quo is, and you can play with different models. So it's a very forecast-oriented tool. And then the other one that I refer to from Private Data Labs is the climate finance tracker, and they're just pretty much trying to, as best as they can, get the different sources. And it doesn't only mean venture, private equity, all of these other kind of uh, financing sources going into climate. And this is where it gets interesting. If you start combining these tools, you look at En-ROADS, see where impacts are, what are maybe big areas of like, oh, this could work. These are places we need to really work better or focus on from an impact perspective. And then you look at the financing, and for the most part, there's always a disconnect between these, areas that we know are big problems and the financing going to. But it also comes back to it's not just because financing will flow towards efficient systems. Like investors like to make returns. It comes back to, is there the right solution? Is there the right business model? So I always like the caveat is like, well, just because the sector isn't getting financing doesn't mean you can't explore it. But if you're thinking from an impact perspective, you might want to also explore the ones that are high impact and not as much finance today, right? Maybe you're the one who figures out an interesting model or an interesting solution, and both of them working together to actually make that an attractive industry in itself. And I think just to, and then there's other sources, Sightline, which is CTVC. They have this dashboard for actually investors and more data people, but for the most part, their newsletter, and they do put out those reports. Those are great kind of places to look for. And yeah, I hinted we do a podcast, but there's various sources out there that would be useful if you're exploring, right? And once you want to go deeper, start getting to Crane and other tools of that nature where it's more crunching the numbers. But I think what we're discussing right now is where do you start? How do I even frame myself if I'm new to climate? How do I even orient myself? And I think one thing that we didn't talk about, and it's not a tool, it's more a mindset or a reflection of yourself. What are your experiences? What are your networks? How do you want to actually contribute to this? Right? What would fulfill your days? Like just because I say electrification, buildings and industry is super impactful and there's a lot of money flowing there. Is that what you want to do? Like, do you have any interest? Do you have any? And that's the other thing. If you're former founders know, but if you're a first time founder, there's going to be good days and bad days. You're going to have highs and lows. And on those low days, you really want to care about what you're working on, not because the numbers say it's good, but you actually care about it. Could be a personal reason, right? You were affected in some capacity. I think the last that I saw was like 80% of people have, in some shape or form, whether family members has been affected by a natural disaster. So if you make the connections there that this is a climate issue, maybe it's in one of those capacities. But I think that's something we don't typically talk about when we think of founders. Where should you start? We sometimes jump straight into the impact or the money, but I always think the personal is a big factor one should consider. But it's a more mental model, self-reflection piece. That how do I want to contribute my time? It doesn't always also mean founder, right? You could be part of the founding team, and they need your engineering know-how, but you also don't want the headache of being a founder because there's a lot of things you're going to have to piecemeal together, and you can work with others to figure it out and have co-founders if it lines up. But it's a lot of work, and is that the journey you want to go on? And for some, yes, and for some, no. But you can still be in this industry. So I just don't want people to walk away. Oh, maybe I don't want to be a founder. Please contribute if you're interested and you think there's alignment. That high likelihood you can find something to get involved in.
Yeah, yeah, I find people sometimes get maybe married to the idea of being a founder and then are like fishing around for the what. And you have to have that why, even for small business, like that is true as well. If you don't have a compelling personal connection and something that drives you forward, you're going to be spending 5, 6, 7 years on this one project, and it has a low likelihood of success. Like this is not a given. So I appreciate that advice of finding that connection, finding your why, and starting from there. The clinical approach of like, yeah, like what on paper makes sense here, not going to sustain you, I think, in the long run. So I want to wrap up our conversation talking a little bit about storytelling. I think, yeah, both of us have some background in storytelling. And I personally see it lacking a lot, like coming from tech and then into climate. It's really interesting. Yeah. How people talk about it, like how people talk about their connection, how people talk about the work that they're doing and the way that they're doing it can be so dry at times. And I see it falling flat, even with the people that, they need it to resonate with the most. So I would love just like kind of like big picture, like thoughts on storytelling and climate, audiences, and how do founders think about that, maybe especially if they have more of a technical background than a creative one.
Yeah, I think a lot of people tend to discount storytelling for the most part, because they only look at it with a narrative of an investor pitch or
Mhm.
or this is my brand marketing pitch. But storytelling matters because it touches on almost every stakeholder that will interact, whether you're hiring people, whether you're trying to build exposure for customers to come on board, all of this plays a role. And I don't just mean like the PR side, I mean like the actual fundamentals of why is this company doing what it does? Why are you the founder? So like you're pitching an investor, why are you the one bringing me the solution? Was it your technical background? Is that what's to connect? I need to connect dots. All storytelling is for the most part a flow unless you're doing like experimental stuff. It tends to be like there's some flow and it's easy to follow along. And in let's say the pitch format that I'm referring to of these companies, any company, right? You're one trying to say, why is the founder working on this? The founder is now trying to pitch investors. Was a technical reason? Because you can always make the marketing case, right? The market case of, yeah, it's the biggest market or the TAM is big and the economics make sense. But at the end of the day, people discount the company is initially when it starts for now, it's human driven, and that founder or the founding team is going to have to be able to convey that not only to the investor who put the money in, but to the talent they need. Like your first 10 hires can make or break your company. And it's like, well, who are you attracting? And that comes back to your storytelling. Are you able to convert the ones you've attracted that you think are great fits as well? Again, storytelling, like all of this plays a role. And yes, finances does play a role, right? How much you're able to pay someone. But at the end of the day, this is one of the opportunities because of what we're talking about, climate specifically. Anyone interested in the space, has some motivation that in some ways goes beyond um, how much you're going to get paid. So if you're matching a equivalent of something else, you could win if your storytelling is good. My point is going back to what I said, impact investing, right? People are investing their time, potentially planning to join your company, investors investing in capital, but also their time as well to, nurture this company. And if you understand all that, yeah, narrative and storytelling plays a role. And I think it starts with what we said, the why. Like why are you even going to tackle this? Why you? And just, just apply that why to a few of these kind of areas. But you only do that after you have some type of idea to want to pursue in the first place. But like I think don't discount your connection to the problem, but and then how are you going to, create that story around that? Right? What motivated? And some people it is that personal layer they add to it, like we were affected or something, and then that just motivation, right? Then everything else they share is about their learning and their everything they went through, and that now shows the investor, oh yeah, this person's actually committed. They've shown in this X amount of time, they went from an outsider, not in the climate world, to someone who's come up with a very interesting model. Now I'll go into the financials, the TAM, and figure out does it even make sense as a business. But you hooked me with okay, that story made sense, and you through your learnings you taught me something as well.
Mm.
I came across this problem in climate. I was affected by it. And now I wanted to go deeper. I realized this was a problem no one was thinking about or addressing big enough. My background in X helps me understand it in a different perspective where I have a new solution. I'm hooked. Let's get to understanding about your finance, and then we'll talk about more. Can you also convey that storytelling, the team you've hired, and all that?
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, I talk to a lot of founders in my role, and even just in like very casual calls where I'm not an investor, I'm thinking about how can I support them? How can work on climate support them? Sometimes to even just get like to the understanding of like, what do you do? It can be 20 minutes sometimes. And that is a big problem. And a lot of times I think founders don't want the feedback of like, I don't care really what you do. I care right now that you can't talk about it. Like until you're not going to move forward until it is clear and it is compelling. It's a lot of people, I think, again, especially, I don't want to like hate on engineers. I love engineers, but like often I see engineers kicking the can down the road. Like I'll pay attention to this when I'm ready to pitch to VCs. Like that feels like that natural point. To your point though, there's so many opportunities that where you need to be able to tell that story earlier. Even like co-founders, like you said, like just to get that first connection, it is so much based on like our backgrounds is just like social animals. If you can't tell the story, why would I trust you with my time? Even for a 30-minute informational call, let alone like money and energy and yeah, my 40, 50, 60 hours a week of my life that I might commit to this vision here. So for those who feel like they're struggling there, how do you start? How do you get better at storytelling if this is a thing you've never even thought about, maybe?
Well, I'm biased because I've always come from a learn by doing or immersive exposure. That's my own like philosophy. So yeah, some of it is just, hey, are there people sharing decks or what are kind of like what have people done and do I see beyond what the deck is, but understanding what the construction of the deck. I don't mean just break it down like, oh, this is the team slide, this all that. But when you're looking at that slide from X company you find fascinating, oh, they're really interesting. Well, do you see the connection? Do you see why it was that founder that was able to convince investors? Because a lot of times what I'm referring to is like you're probably looking at a deck from a company that's Series A or B now that put it out for people to see. But instead of you just looking at, okay, can I follow the formatting or follow the slide order? I always try and say, well, start paying attention to why it all came together and why this company was the one that was able to raise a round. Again, that's more for just immersing yourself in more storytelling. Obviously, some great founders that they're on podcasts and these different places. So like I always feel like that's one layer of the learning, and the other part is like I said, work by doing, getting on calls with you, Kim, and attempting to. I know you think it's too early of an idea, but even if you just did a single workshop right now, walk out of that workshop with a concise, high level. This is what we're going to do, and this is why it matters. And it could be long, it could be a paragraph, but at least it's something. Then you'll refine it down to a single sentence, or again, conciseness works, or forcing yourself to be concise works, because it takes all that abstract, oh, I have this general idea and all these great things. But if you can at least give me what it does, what industry, how it's like those simple one word answers or short answers, now compile that into your like long paragraph. Great, that's something at least. That's a first attempt of storytelling, right? I put together a paragraph of the general concepts and ideas floating in my head that I think are connected. It forces you to connect them now. It's like, well, you're saying you're going to sell to those buildings at this rate, and this is your go to market, and because your background is X. Great, I just heard a high level 30-second elevator pitch of why you're working on this, why you came across, and that's it. Like, great, that's the first attempt at storytelling. Even the greatest storytellers are people who present or do TED Talks. You know how many drafts and iterations they go through? So everything you do look at as well, a lot of times it is polished or polished either post editing or even before the actual production. There was practice. There was even podcast guests sometimes do that. It's just planning a lot of things. So what you do see is always the refining. And what you want to try and do is now, can I understand how that came together? How did they piece it together? Contextual storytelling. And then, yeah, if you're a fan of great shows or movies, yeah, there are things out there that kind of like showcase kind of like these founder stories and all that, these docudramas about these various tech companies. But that's what I want to say. Like what we're referring to, these climate solutions, at essence, they're a tech company. They're still a tech startup in that sense. They're fundraising in these routes. Again, different capital stacks, but you're still fundraising from some party, and you need to tell them a story. And the next part is like you're now going to hire the team to scale up what you do. You're going to have some level of sales or partnership interaction to deploy the technologies. All those fundamentals, I don't care what you sell, beyond SaaS, because SaaS is something where we can just sign up on your own from a consumer and do it differently. But everything else has some level of interactions and sales process that most traditional businesses, even small businesses, have. So I also do think of climate, you could be working on solutions that aren't venture oriented, but they're small business. Like there are many great things we need to do at the climate front lines, and that's the small businesses, because that's the interactions of our day to day. So I don't think you should limit your thinking as well. So as you think through storytelling, well, is where you realize, wait, maybe what I'm describing isn't that big for venture, but small business or local or regional, all these are great businesses, and they still might have finances that make sense. The mistake some people make is thinking, okay, there's only one tool, right? I'm a nail, I need a hammer. And there might be something else that can push me, right? So like just take that analogy and flip it. But there's more than venture out there. And if you're thinking through storytelling and thinking through all the market, the dynamics we talked about, just consider maybe you did stumble upon something interesting. The model maybe needs to be shifted from a growth or projection aspect, but it still might be a great business. And it can survive in this capitalist system that I initially talked about. So,
Yeah. I would just add to your earlier point too of like, I feel like we often discount emotion when we are in the realm of like when we're in startup land, when we're thinking about starting a venture, and especially if it's like heavily like tech based, which yeah, in climate most of them are, I think that can get pushed to the side. But when it comes to connecting with people, like that is an inherently emotional thing. And I think there's something to be said of like immersing yourself, as you said, put yourself like in like those environments where you're going to be exposed to stories. So like go to networking events, like go to happy hours where there's other founders. It doesn't even have to be climate founders. Like just hear live the less polished stuff too. Like I think watching TED Talks and watching like looking at the awesome pitch decks from like Airbnb or whatever is always out there as like a great early pitch deck can be a bit intimidating because they are at this level and there's so many steps in between. But like go to a, I don't know, like co-founder speed dating event and like hear all the crappy stories and understand, like tune in and like, why is that not resonating with me? Like what's missing from this? And like, who is really compelling? Who is really exciting? And just like getting more of that like real world interaction. I mean, virtual obviously counts as well, but like tune in. How is it making you feel? What's exciting? What is so boring? Like it doesn't have to be this clinical analysis. Like your gut, I think, plays a big part in this. And I think I see people undervaluing, I think that element of it that is that's such a big part of it. Uh and pay attention. Like I've led workshops before, more for small business on just like yeah, like storytelling for small business and, ranging from like marketing stuff to early hires, things like growing your team. And you can tell people are reading their emails. It's like if you're going to invest the time to like learn a skill, especially one that is so yeah, like human oriented, connect with humans as much as you can. Like do it in person if you can, but if you're going to do it virtual, like make space for that. This is an important thing. You need to give it your time and attention. You can't check Slack on your phone while you're trying to learn about like a good pitch deck. Like that's just not going to work for you. Which sounds obvious, but I think our attention is just pulled in so many ways right now. But I think storytelling in particular just requires a lot that we're not giving it in climate, I think. Anyway, it's a problem that kind of keeps me up at night, just because of my background in storytelling. It stresses me out. Like we need to do better there if a lot of these early stage founders are going to be successful. So, all right, we've talked about everything we set out to talk about. Congratulations, we did that. I want to know, just like big picture, what haven't we talked about yet? What haven't we touched upon that we should? Any last thoughts you want to leave people with?
Well, yeah, it's biased because it's my perspective, but how I think of solving for climate, or this is part of my thesis, and it's always evolving, but it is going back to again systems, but thinking of it in a different way. It's more than just CO2 equivalent. It's what does that mean, right? It's going back to what I said, how we produce, consume, manufacture. All these have repercussions, and the failure from the capitalist side is the negative costs are just never accounted. And I don't mean the carbon side. I'm talking about the social health, longer term trends. Going back to when the petrochemical industry, helped bring life to the world of plastics, we're now starting to realize the damage of microplastics from inflammation to how pervasive it is everywhere. More data will come out over the next decade or so, and we don't properly have solutions for not mitigation, but like adaptation. Like now that everything has some microplastic. So my point, going back to coming from this understanding of where things will go, it means, well, thinking through adaptation, but the narrative we're pushing for is no longer carbon dioxide. We're talking about this plastic thing you care about. You have kids. You do. If you're even attempting to not use plastic cutting boards, you care, right? That's the thread I'm gonna pull on. Now that we get that, now we're gonna start talking more about, well, it's the petrochemical and all, and then how do we displace that? Is it co-option? Is it, and all of these things, and as you go down this rabbit hole, and this is where again going back to it's a complex system. You go down the rabbit hole, well, everything's connected. Like that is jobs, right? There are jobs associated to that plastic production industry. Well, if we're thinking of climate solutions, and this is my broader thinking, for us to tackle this, we actually maybe need to be doing concurrent solutions at the same time. So if you're tackling the plastic displacement, well, I'm tackling the job adjustment from those of that industry. And then at the same time, that byproduct input that was considered cheap or free because it's a byproduct of oil and gas or something else. Well, what do we do with that? So if you can almost answer, but no, they won't adopt it because of this, and they won't adopt it because of this. Well, maybe you don't need to solve for it. So what we've been trying to do is collaborate with other founders, some more far along, some less. But the idea is that maybe they're sitting on a bottleneck to their industry and having those conversations at either those co-founder events that you kind of hinted, like someone's thinking about this and you're realizing, oh, someone else also thinking about this from a different perspective. Maybe both of those ideas together are stronger if they go to market together. And what does that mean? Like, it means reimagining even how we think of financing some of these things, where it's like, well, there's almost two ventures. Independently, they don't work, but together they do, but they need their own teams. And they have we ever seen a dual company pitching a VC? Like maybe we need to consider some of these things because that's a complexity of climate and the systems they operate within. But that also means we need to figure out new models, and so that's where I think thinking in systems takes you down the rabbit hole, and you kind of need to know where you want to stop going down that rabbit hole. But you'll come across maybe an idea or two to explore further as you go down that kind of thought, experiment.
Good. I think that's a great final thought to leave people with. So I so appreciate you taking the time, Murad, to chat with us today. And in terms of the AMA, so January 23rd, Murad has agreed to spend about uh, all day Thursday, basically. We will have this open. You don't actually have to be online for 24 hours, Murad, but we will be taking questions for all day on Thursday, the 23rd. So founders, future founders, if you have questions for Murad about anything we've talked about today, impact investing, understanding carbon impact, storytelling, I think would be a great one. We want your questions. So post them in Roll Founders. That's where we'll be hosting the AMA, and Murad will reply to you. And then Murad, do you want to leave us? I'm curious to know what conversations you're looking forward to having, or like what questions are you hoping people ask?
Well, I like the divergent. So if you have something really out there that's like, wait, well, could this potentially work within an industry? I don't mind those conversations, but they can go down weird rabbit holes. Um, but in general, I think it's how are you looking at something within our existing structure of capitalism, manufacturing, everything else? How are you looking at it differently? And what's your take to different? How are you thinking of that solution? That those are I personally enjoy those, but everything you discuss can be anything can be discussed as an AMA, right? So
Perfect. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to the more divergent, more weird conversations as well. That'll be entertaining. But yes, all questions are welcome. Join us in Roll Founders on the 23rd. All right, Murad, thank you again for taking the time. I appreciate it. I'll talk to you soon.
thank you. Bye.